All right, welcome back. Now, these are surely not the best of times for Nigerian banks. No thanks, of course, to the economic situation in the country. In the last 3 months or thereabout, we have seen massive job losses in the banking sector in this country. Just last week, or I should say 2 weeks ago, it was all over the news that Zenith Bank laid off around 1,200 of its staff. Now, this massive layoffs is pitting the banks against labor unions in the country who have been picketing banks to compel them to stop the retrenchment. Now, the Nigerian government even intervened at some point with the Minister of Labour and Productivity, Chris Ngige, threatening that the government would withdraw the operating license of any bank that downsizes its workforce. This development is taking place on the heels of a sudden takeover of one of Nigeria's commercial banks by the Central Bank of Nigeria. The CBN says it had to take over Skye Bank because the bank had consistently been on their debit floor for the past few years, a clear indication, of course, of its sick financial condition. There are also reports that 2 other banks are just as sick as Skye Bank and that the CBN may still intervene in the coming days, weeks or months, but that has actually not been officially confirmed. One thing we do know is that the size of the non-performing loans of some of our banks is quite worrisome. CBN Governor Godwin Emefiele has continued to maintain that the Nigerian banking industry is still solid and at a sound footing. But earlier in the week, we spoke to a former bank CEO, Tilewa Adebajo, on the action of the Central Bank of Nigeria. And of course, we asked for his take now over the decision of the CBN to take over Skye Bank now, as well as the banking industry generally. Here's what he had to say.
The problem I have with the information that the central bank governor has given is that it is not conclusive and decisive. In a situation where you have banks that are not meeting their capital adequacy requirements, most of these banks have been in the lending window of the central bank for many months, and I think there are many other banks that have been in that window for several months. There needs to be a systematic and an organized method of doing this in a very decisive manner in order not to cause panic in the system. And if there are other banks that have failed stress tests and are in distress, then I think it's important that all those banks be fished out so that it does not cause a systemic problem. And this is really where the problem is, because there's really lack of confidence in trying to not disclose what the other situation is, because the action has to be decisive. If you have banks that are in distress, let's take the action one fell swoop, and we've done this before, and I think that that is really where we have a problem now. The Nigerian banks have recapitalized over the last couple of years, and I think there's been a very stable industry. But the challenges that the Nigerian banks faced was that a lot of banks built up a lot of their portfolio. Close to 40% of Nigerian banks' portfolio were in US dollars. And apart from having close to 40% of your portfolio in US dollars, there was a significant amount of that portfolio that was towards oil and gas clients. So when the problem started with the fall in oil prices and we began to have challenges with availability of dollar, it has impacted negatively on the balance sheet of most Nigerian banks. If you look at right now, you find yourself in a situation whereby most of the Nigerian banks now have close to 10% of their portfolio as non-performing loans. Now, this is more than twice the statutory requirements. So there is a major problem right now with the banks in terms of their non-performing loans. And now with the Nigerian economy going into a recession, the problem has been exacerbated. In those days, we hadn't created AMCON. Right now, we don't have the money and we don't have the resources to create another AMCON. So it's going to be very difficult to convince any Nigerian to bail out banks again. So this is really where we have the challenge. So it is important that the central bank governor comes out in a very decisive manner and take bold steps to nip this problem in the bud. Majority of the Nigerian banks are very sound and properly run. But there's some banks that have problems and have issues due to management, insider loans, and a lot of basically bad management. And what the central bank governor needs to do is to do a stress test on all the banks, and these ones that are not able to cope, he should act decisively so that the Nigerian banking public can have more confidence in the banking system. But overall, I think that there's not a significant problem if we can isolate these banks quickly before they begin to cause significant problems.
Well, joining me now to discuss this issue further is Dr. Lukman Raimi, who is an economist with the Center for Entrepreneurship Development of the Yaba College of Technology. Doc, thank you very much for coming on the program. First off, of course, you use the bank. Are you worried at the state of Nigerian banks today?
Well, frankly speaking, I am. And presently, I own about 3 banks, Skye Bank inclusive. The implication is that if we are not sure about the health of our banking sector, we stand to lose our income, our life savings. So I'm personally worried. And some of us who also do business part-time also keep our money in banks. So the implication is that if some of these banks are pronounced unhealthy or bankrupt, then we are likely going to develop high blood pressure or even sudden heart attack.
Now, after announcing the takeover of Skye Bank, the CBN governor actually came out and, even days later came out to still emphasize that the situation of the banking industry in this country is still very solid, that the banks are on sound footing.
Exactly.
But, despite that, people still do not have that much confidence in the banking industry in this country. Why do you think that is the case?
Yes, as a regulator and as a responsible regulator, the CBN should be professional in its pronouncements. And for those of us who are economists, we know it's a way of managing the situation. The situation is bad, but it could be managed.
Because, of course, we're hearing reports that it's not just Skye Bank, that there are other banks
exactly.
that are
they are under surveillance. They are being watched and reviewed on a regular basis. But the case of a central bank was problematic, and that was why
Skye Bank, you mean?
Skye Bank, exactly, came in fully to change the management so that the bank will not lose customers' confidence. Because once a bank loses confidence, there will be panic withdrawal, and it will lead to another problem, which is sudden death.
What do you make of this decision by banks suddenly to start sacking their workers? I mean, we've seen this wave of retrenchment now hit banks. Zenith Bank the other day reported to have retrenched 1,200.
Exactly.
Even before Zenith Bank, quite a lot of other banks, had actually embarked on this massive retrenchment. What do you think could be responsible? We've had people say, well, part of the reason could just be because of the Treasury single account, because the federal government had to pull out its money from most of these banks, exposing them to the fact that, other than government funds, they actually had nothing much. And then the issue of non-performing loans, of course, we're going to get to that.
Yes, we need to put the issue in context. We should look at the causes rather than the symptom. If you look at banking in this part of the world, banking is supposed to facilitate wealth creation by mobilizing idle funds and put it in the real sector of the economy, where the money is.
We don't see
but
that
most
yet.
of them don't put their money in the real sector because it takes a while to get returns. So they prefer to sell money for money, give to somebody who can borrow at short term basis and get interest. So they have been doing that for ages. Secondly, they leverage on multiple accounts from the ministries and the government agencies, polytechnics, universities, college of education ministries, and so on and so forth. So they had good day using some of these funds. With the pronouncement of a Treasury single account, the implication is that they were no more having field day. So the practice of selling money to make money actually was problematic. And therefore, a typical businessman, once you are not able to make enough profit, you won't be able to pay salaries. And that's what happened, occurred to the banks. They couldn't pay salaries because they were not getting idle funds as they used to in the olden days. So the logical thing for a businessman, of course, is to lay off. So the foundation is that DEJI360 outlets where they get free funds from the ministry, government agencies, because government is the biggest spender.
That's quite true.
Exactly. So that was why they waited maybe something, the situation would change. But unfortunately, the oil sector crisis also affected them. So these two causes, the treasury single account and the downturn in the oil sector, actually affected them badly. So the logical thing to do is to downsize.
Now let's look at the effect now that the oil sector has had on our banks. I mean, no question at all. As Tilewa Dibajo was saying there, exactly, that most of them are actually exposed to these oil companies. They've lent so much to the oil companies. Of course, they would prefer to lend money to the oil companies because, you know, the calculation is that the oil companies will pay, they may not default and all of that. So the real sector definitely suffers. If the situation with the oil industry, if the price of oil does not pick up very fast, do you think we might see more takeovers of banks in this country by the CBN?
Well, logically, if the oil sector does not actually move up, we should expect more bankruptcy in the banking sector. But I think with the so-called restructuring that the CBN is coming up with, the bank should be trained on better ways of making money. For instance, the agri sector is actually moving up.
But they're not looking at that.
That's the reality. Look at business organization with prospects, with future. Invest your money as joint venture or simply loan, and you smile at the end of the day. Look at construction. Federal government has just started the implementation of the budget. Contractors will need huge funds before they are paid by government. That's another good avenue to make money, construction. And also, if you look at even the higher institution, government is pumping money into entrepreneurship projects and also infrastructural development. So service providers will need funds. So they should actually sit down with consultants to actually reorientate them on how to do real banking rather than speculative banking they are doing currently. So I think they should readjust, restructure, and then move ahead and do real banking as is done in developed countries.
Let me get your take on the decision, you know, that intervention by the federal government when the banks started laying off massively. You know, the Minister of Labor and Productivity coming out now to sort of issue a warning to the banks, telling them to stop or else their operating license would be withdrawn. But the question is, what do you expect the banks to do when you've actually taken the chunk of the money they had? You've taken their money in the name of TSA, you've taken this money away. It just would be difficult to sustain it. And in any case, these banks are private entities. Would it be normal for the government now to come in and start telling them, you know, as bad as, you know, the idea of laying off workers may be, but would it also be proper for the government to start telling banks not to do it?
Of course, it's not proper. We are in the era of change.
And then we see NLC picketing the banks as well, asking them to stop.
You see, people need to understand that in the domain of capitalism, the owner of capital is at liberty to hire and fire. Banks are not Father Christmas. They are not Santa Claus. They are not making profits, so they can't retain those people. What they do in developed countries is that fine, you are the owner of your banks, you can hire and fire, but in the interest of national image, what we can do, we can give you bailouts, retain them so that unemployment situation in the country will be salvaged. That is what they do in developed countries. In 2008, when US gave bailout to some of these big banks and companies, what they were actually doing was to save jobs. Because the policy of government is to increase job, and the reality of the situation led to people being laid off. Instead of having contradiction in government policy and private sector policies, they now gave them bailout. So what government should do, we are going to support you.
Now, but would you be supporting a company that has been obviously, you know, mismanaged, so to speak? In the case of Skye Bank, what we've been told is that, yes, you know, that part of the problem was that of management. There was no proper management. There was mismanagement, a situation where the board, for instance, was lending money to itself and not, you know, that kind of situation. You don't expect the government to step in to begin to fund that kind of mismanagement where a chairman, for instance, of a bank would sign off loans to himself and then he doesn't pay back?
I think before government will give out bailout, banks will be reclassified. Those whose water low as a result of a bad management should not be given bailout. But for those whose difficulty was actually caused by economic downturn in the country,
and quite a number of
course,
them that way,
they should be assisted for two reasons. One, you want to keep job, and again, you don't want to send wrong signal to investors and the larger international community. Because once your banks are failing, the implication is that it will affect all sectors of the economy. So government should sustain them, should support them to keep job as well as the national image. But for those who became bankrupt on account of mismanagement, of course, they shouldn't be supported. And that's the yardstick in different parts of the world. You must reclassify and give the genuine while you don't assist the fake ones.
Let's talk about Skye Bank now. How much damage do you think that has done to confidence in the banking industry, the takeover of Skye Bank? Because that's one bank. We're talking about a bank that acquired a failed bank not quite long ago, and now that bank that acquired a failed bank not quite long ago is now been taken over. I mean, it just doesn't send a good message at all. It kills confidence. How much do you think that confidence in our banking industry now has been eroded by what we're seeing?
Actually, it's very difficult to estimate the degree of damage, but it has actually done a serious damage because the big boys who have funds, of course, will move them out tacitly. They won't tell them they are going, but tacitly they will move their banks to other LD banks. And for foreign investors who are looking towards Skye Bank, of course, they will be scared. They will prefer to put their money elsewhere. And for the average Nigerians, of course, stylishly, they will start withdrawing their funds. But CBN has done a very good thing. Its pronouncement is professional. It says it's not really bankrupt, but on account of bad mismanagement, they felt they should bring in competent professional to salvage the situation. So I still feel that there's no cause to worry based on what CBN has done in the last 2 weeks.
We saw the new management of Skye Bank the other day going to the floor of the Nigerian Stock Exchange, trying to assure investors that everything was okay and all of that. But, despite that assurance, we've not really seen Skye Bank shares now pick up at all. People are still scared. A lot of people have actually sold out. What do you think the challenge could be, for the new management now in terms of winning confidence back to this bank and, probably getting back some of their lost customers?
Well, I think in line with the best practice around the world, they need to do a lot of reputation building, corporate social responsibility, advertisement, and of course, meeting the captains of industry, telling them the situation on ground presently. With that, they will be able to woo some of their former customers and depositors. So I think the present management, they have the pedigree and the integrity in the financial industry to actually do that.
You coordinate an entrepreneurship center. Yeah. One of the biggest problems with entrepreneurs in this part of the world is that they do not get support from, especially the banks. I mean, the cost of funds very high. You don't have situations where banks, doesn't happen in this country anyway. You hardly get from commercial banks. You hardly get single-digit,
interest
loans.
rates.
And, exactly. So, what do you? And you look at these commercial banks. They all have their SMEs departments, and most of them would tell us they've voted significant amount of money to SME development. But we don't see them giving out this money. We don't see it happening. What exactly do you think is the problem? Is it that most of the SMEs we have are not viable, or you just can't see a clearer path to repayment for some of these SMEs, and that is why the banks are not, actually coming in to help the way they should?
Yeah, the problem really, we have actually diagnosed that even in the center among the facilitators and researchers. We have come to identify a structural problem if you look at the SME fund with Bank of Industry and the ones domiciled in the commercial banks, they have what we call stringent conditions attached to access to those loans. Whereas in developed countries and emerging economies like South Africa and so on and so forth, you see, if you don't have collateral, that doesn't mean you can't get loans. At times, there are some things that government can do. There are some organizations with credibility. They don't have land, they don't have big assets, but they have the trust and the reputation. So government can stand in for them, government can vouch for them, and ditto for some government agencies, like some of these SMEDAN and so on and so forth. You look at them and classify them. These are future enterprises. If you put your money there, you are good to go. They should stand as guarantor for such enterprises. Then again, in some part of the world, government will not give them money. They would tell bank, channel your lending to certain sectors of the economy. And when those people produce, government will buy from them immediately. Whether the quality is standard or not. They want them to sell, go back to production. If you do that repeatedly, your quality will be enhanced and you become stable. It's deliberate. But in this part of the world, the conditions are very, very stringent. And until we de-emphasize land and other big assets, we won't get it right as far as entrepreneurship is concerned. Take, for instance, in Russia and Brazil, there's what they call incubation center now. You are an SME practitioners, you can't afford machines, you can go to government incubation and work there for 1 or 2 years to be sufficiently. Yes,
you can stand on your own.
You can stand on your own, but in this part of the we have
incubation. And at that center, the basic facilities
they are there, equipment and what have you. Even in some university, like Stanford University, government and the university, they help students establish their business. If you have fantastic innovation and creativity, they help set up that business and they owe 5%. When the business grows, the 5% of government will be translated into millions of dollars. So this is the model being used in other parts of the country. But in our own case, it's just go to banks, borrow. No. There are non-banking platforms where you can
and the banks don't even borrow anyway. They don't actually borrow you. They don't give you the money. The conditions are just stringent.
It's stringent, which even SME practitioner cannot even meet. Before you can thrive as a businessman, you must consider 2R. The first one, the big one, return on investment, which is yours, and interest, which is the small r. Most times, the small r is bigger than the big R.
And that is quite true.
That's the motivation to invest.
That's quite true.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't doubt that. Yeah. But overall, in your own estimation, do you think the Nigerian banking industry is still very solid?
It's solid, but there is need for reorientation. A real sector of the economy, that is where the money is. Construction, agri, engineering, established factories. Even look at the eateries, service providers.
I mean,
they can support them, exactly, using this second set of franchise. There are so many fantastic students in the universities who have this concept of franchise. You can partner with them as a joint venture. So instead of looking for interest, you are actually sharing part of the profits. That is the thinking in different parts of the world, not selling money to make money or looking for cheap way of getting profits.
Dr. Rami, thank you very much for coming on the program.
Yes.
And thank you very much for your thoughts. Well, that's it on the program. If you want to watch it again, it's simple. Just log on to our website, tv360nigeria.com. You'll find this video and lots more there. You can also watch us on our YouTube channel. The address is youtube.com/TV360Nigeria. Do subscribe now to get the latest videos and updates. So join us on Google+. That's at TV360 Nigeria. Or simply like us on Facebook. The address is facebook.com/TV360 online. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at TV360 online. Well, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again next week.